problems for the local theories. So, the local theorists say that our subjective experiences overflow our capacity for attention and access. As such, conscious experiences must depend on early sensory activity rather than late-stage PFC processing. The latter can't represent all of the rich details. Instead, consciousness is a matter of having the right kind of early sensory activity. It isn't tied to specific PFC functions, which is why many higher cognitive functions can be exercised unconsciously. If the localists are right, then consciousness shouldn't be restricted to highly intelligent creatures. It would mostly be a matter of having the right biological or physical substrate for early sensory processing. Most mammals have similar sensory cortices to ours. Much of what we know about how our own visual cortices work come from studies of these animals. But are conscious experiences really as rich as they think? Some subjects may say that their experiences represent rich details, fair enough, but sometimes it seems like they're just mistaken. I mean, how could we have seen the colorful details in the periphery when that information wasn't so perfectly rich on the retina in the first place? Oftentimes, we just think that we see all of the details, only to realize that when asked what those details really are, we might not be so sure after all. And how can local theorists explain the results of so many studies showing the PFC activity to be associated with conscious perception? Some of them showed PFC activity even in the absence of the confounds of task performance capacity or signal strength. They may say that such activity reflects things that happen after you become conscious, like the act of reporting about the experience, but not the experience itself. Traditionally, localists also tend to write off PFC activity by saying that lesions to the PFC don't knock out conscious experiences. But is that right? If PFC activity just reflects reporting, then shouldn't lesions to the PFC knock out our ability to report about our experiences? Then how come many PFC patients seem fine doing that? Things just don't seem to add up. It looks like one has to admit that PFC lesions are more complicated than that. We can't neglect the fact that the PFC consists of many different areas working together in both hemispheres. They're also densely and bidirectionally connected to the parietal areas. So if only one node in the whole network is damaged, the other areas could take over. This phenomenon of degeneracy is well known. And given this context, we might not expect damage to the PFC to abolish the relevant functions entirely. But despite that, damage to the PFC actually does cause some very clear deficits. If there is bilateral damage to large areas of the lateral PFC, patients often can't be tested properly in psychophysics tasks. If the damage is unilateral, patients show specific deficits in perceptual metacognition, but the damage does not abolish the general ability to report. It is also not metacognition in general that is abolished, because in memory metacognition tasks, these patients did fine. Instead, it's the ability to introspect on perceptual experiences that seems to be impaired. Now, we could ask, what kind of conscious experience is it when we have no idea whether we're seeing things correctly or not? What kind of conscious experiences defy introspection? Do these patients really have entirely normal perceptual experiences? And it's also worth noting that TMS to the DLPFC caused some very similar deficits too. Now, about functions. We saw in the previous class that some studies showed that subliminal primes can influence higher cognitive functions. But where is the evidence that all of these functions can be exercised 100% unconsciously? Do we really think that none of these functions ever truly require consciousness? Then why are we conscious? Well, here's the funny thing. If unconscious information can get all the way into the PFC, as some subliminal priming experiments have shown, then the idea that the PFC is just for conscious access isn't quite right either. Recall that this has been the model that localists want us to believe. But it's not quite so simple. The PFC probably does many things, some of which could be important for consciousness in ways that are not yet obvious to us. So writing off the entire PFC just seems like a bad idea. Now, imagine that you are a die-hard local theorist. What would you say to those arguments? Try as hard as you can to defend the localist position. Can you reply to every point convincingly? Do you really think that the localist view holds water?